So what I thought would be really helpful, at least from my perspective, even if nobody else's, is to get a sense of who's in the room, what kind of people we have here, because I think really quite a mixed audience, my understanding, sort of come along to these seminars. So who, and you're allowed to put up your hand more than once as well, so don't worry. Who in the room would describe himself as an academic or researcher? Lovely, so fortunately for me, not too many people. Who would describe himself as a sort of mental health practitioner of some description? Wonderful. Who would describe himself as an education practitioner or kind of school-based person? Lovely. As a commissioner of some sort? Nobody. And who perhaps would describe himself as working sort of in social care, sort of social care practitioner? A few people. Anyone not put their hand up? Good. That's most people. Oh, what sort of person are you?
I don't know what you consider within the social care. I'm a data analyst and I work for a youth program, the sports.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so a bit of research, perhaps data analysis, a bit of practice as well. Lovely. Thanks so much. So I'm going to talk today for about 45 minutes or so, a bit about my understanding of emotional resilience and why it matters to us where I work in Newham, and some of the lessons which I think we've taken from attempting to implement and evaluate some resilience promoting work in teenagers in Newham. Bit of a chance afterwards for questions. Obviously, if you have a burning question along the way, please do ask. I'd much rather stop if something's not clear, and we can go from there. And then clearly, as you can see, there's no tables in here, but there'll be a chance afterwards, if people are interested, to kind of break out and have kind of smaller group discussions, and then perhaps we'll come back and get a bit of feedback from them. But I hope that's what everyone was signed up for. If not, I won't be shy if you go. Perfect. So that's kind of, people like lots of understanding of what resilience is, all sorts of understandings, but for us in Newham, certainly for myself, that's kind of how we understand it. That's from Marston, that resilience is a positive adaptation to adversity despite serious threats to adaptation or development. So doing perhaps better than you would expect, bouncing back from difficult situations. Those are some of the kind of looser descriptions that people describe. And certainly our learning in Newham, and my learning has been that resilience is not really one thing, but really kind of a set of competencies. You know, different things which in this context, a young person has, some of which are quite clearly things which are just down to things inside of themselves, but other things which are much more to do with their interconnected relationships with their surroundings. And so it's quite important to kind of, at least from my perspective, to kind of think about it in those two ways. So those are kind of some of the competencies. And what's interesting is you can think there's quite good ways for measuring each of those competencies as well. So ranging from kind of connectedness with school, with home, with your peers, to inside things like your sense of autonomy, your sense of self-esteem, how empathetic you are to others, your problem-solving skills and your aspiration. So really, if you say that someone is more resilient, I would understand it as they have a number of those competencies they're doing well at. So why does it matter? Why does it matter to us in Newham? And why perhaps does it matter to lots of other people? I suspect the reason you've all come today is because it does matter to you. Clearly those competencies, I mean, it's always easy. It's like when people say mental health matters because people get better jobs. It's like, well, mental health matters because mental health matters. And I think it's the same with resilience, that actually those competencies matter in their own sense. But I think it's important to stress, as you'll know, and a lot of this is sort of teaching you to suck eggs, but that actually resilience is linked to secondary beneficial outcomes. So I've put down some of the evidence there, but it's sort of much broader links between, if you're more resilient, your people who are supported to become more resilient are less likely to develop significant mental health disorder. They're more likely to be better at school. less likely to be excluded from school, more likely to get better grades, do better than they should or are expected to. And probably not completely independently from that, but less likely to have get involved in what people love to call risky behaviours. That's getting involved in criminal activity or gangs, perhaps substance abuse, perhaps a lot of the things, and this is of bigger interest to us in Newham, a lot of the things which might put you in touch with social services, which is a local authority clearly, and the same in, I'm sure, lots of places where you work, we spend a lot of money on social care. And so actually in trying to make the case for why promoting resilience matters, actually reducing social care referrals, of which improving some of these outcomes contributes to that, is quite important. So in Newham, we've got a lot of risk factors for development of mental health disorder. And actually, our sense is that because of what it's like to live in Newham, a lot of our kids aren't very resilient. There's significant overcrowding, there's huge population churn, people coming and going, very unstable families, a lot of poverty, a lack of peer support. And as a result of these things, actually our kids, we have high rates of mental health disorder and a sense that it's likely that we've got relatively low levels of resilience. And actually what's important is, in view of those risk factors, we're very keen to promote resilience so that actually, despite those risk factors, our kids can do better than expected. It's a great demand for preventative work, and this is really important when you're thinking about doing similar work yourself, that where's the drive? Who are you going to convince to fund this work? Which, whether we like it or not, it comes down to money and politics, and actually our politicians and our leaders in general in East London are very keen on prevention and early intervention work, but only if we can show that it improves outcomes and particularly leads to less care down the line being required. We've been very lucky in Newham with some significant grant from a Big Lottery, this is the HeadStart grant, to be able to pilot a number of approaches to promoting emotional resilience in adolescents. And what I want to focus on now, I'll give an outline of a programme, but I want to focus on what some of our lessons have been from that. So with this funding, we've been piloting a number of approaches across primary and secondary schools over the last year or so, and evaluating, are we reaching the right kids? That's those kids who are more likely to go on to develop mental health problems. That's our target population. Are we reaching them? And are we successfully promoting emotional resilience in those kids? I think I've said that. That's what we're doing. Trying to, through promoting emotional resilience, reduce mental health disorder, improve school attainment and attendance, reduce risky behaviours, and hopefully down the line, as a result of some of those things, reduce the number of kids who become NEET, that is, kids who should be in employment or education but are in neither. And interestingly, I think some of the byproducts of what we're doing, which are of interest to our leaders locally, that school staff having extra capabilities is helpful, and it's thought probably to reduce staff turnover in the schools. But we have parents who are being employed actually as facilitators, so there's new employment opportunities. And ultimately, through the work we're doing, we're trying to make the case for why it's great the Big Lottery are funding this work, but actually we need to make the case that this work's important, it works, and it should be funded anyway. And with any grant, that's always the case. So that's the things we've been testing over the last year or so. I'll talk about 3 of them. Support for school staff, we're going to talk about. I'm not going to talk today about peer-led parent training, but very happy to talk about it another time. We're going to talk about our supported volunteering project. Not going to talk about our resilience campaign, but again, happy another time. And are going to talk about our peer mentoring project. So I'm going to start with peer mentoring. And what I'm going to do each time is kind of describe what we did, and then try to pull out a few of the lessons, and then we'll, and perhaps we'll stop at the end of a peer mentoring just to kind of get your thoughts so far. So our approach, and this has been across all of our approaches, is to see, what's the sense of, we're clearly not starting with a blank slate here. There's lots of evidence, lots of thoughts about, what things do promote resilience. And if we're not sure they promote resilience, do promote some of those secondary outcomes, like improving mental health outcomes. And so it was clear from evidence, many of you will be aware, that mentoring, one-to-one mentoring, can promote those resilience competencies, we looked at the beginning, in both mentors and mentees, and that leads to some of those secondary benefits. Specifically, some of the things from the literature which are talked about are increased connectedness in school, if you think back to those competencies, in the community, and in the family. And what was really interesting to us locally was where we're trying to reach high-risk kids, is that there was some evidence that actually peer approaches, that's older teenagers supporting younger teenagers, is been shown to, it's kind of common sense, but it's nice to see it in the literature, more likely to reach the right kids. Kids are more likely to engage with their peers. And that's been important in a number of our approaches. And the problem was when we looked in Newham at what was available, lots of different peer mentoring programs exist. Many of you might have been involved in the past. And it was quite hard, and actually Rhodes says this in some research, quite hard to work out. It was apparent that some of them are better than others, but it was quite hard to know, what is the best one to choose? We've got this funding, we want to deliver a program, which one do we choose? And it wasn't clear, there wasn't one we could take off the shelf. So we said, let's try and understand what are the key components from other ones which work. So it's not enough just to know peer mentoring works, but what we want to know is what made it work, and what are the bits we can learn from it. We're trying to develop a best practice one, because it doesn't exist, at least locally in the UK. So we set about doing that. I was actually involved with some colleagues at UCL and UCLPartners in conducting a literature review of trying to understand what are the key components, and certainly we can subsequently share that round. And we separated those into kind of categories of how do you recruit appropriate mentors and mentees, those who will benefit? How do you train and supervise those peer mentors? And how do you maintain and support that mentoring, that one-to-one mentoring relationship? That's what we tried to unpick from the literature. We put together in Newham an expert development group. It had psychologists on it. It had youth workers, school staff, and importantly, we trained a group of young people as peer researchers to look at that evidence and say, well, you know what, it's all well and good. What does that actually mean in Newham? How do we develop a program which takes in those components that will actually work in our context? And that's a really important thing I'll keep coming back to. How do you take the literature and apply it locally? And that's quite important. It's not just me making that up. Some evidence from smarter people that that you need to do that actually working with beneficiaries, people who take part in the intervention, make it far more likely to work. So we did that. We worked with those young people to understand the literature. We took all that work, and then our expert group essentially developed, based on those lessons, a model, like a manual for training and supervising and supporting those mentors. How do you recruit the right ones? How do you train and supervise them? The model involves the training and supervision for peer mentors being jointly delivered by a youth worker and a psychologist. So these will be shared afterwards. Clearly, I can't even read that from here. You're not going to be able to read it. But what this is describing, and I think these are going to you afterwards, is how we took a lesson from the literature review, the narrative review, understood from the peer research what that meant, and then describe how that was applied into practice. So it's kind of showing that development process. So we took the model and said, well, so what? It's looking theoretically good. It's based on evidence. Young people looked at it. Will it actually work in Newham? $1 million question. We've got a challenging population, not a typical population. Will it work? So we worked in two local schools, piloted with 36 students, and over time, the mentoring took place once those mentors had been trained and supported. We focused in evaluating it on, was it actually promoting resilience in the mentors and mentees? And importantly, and this is the same for all of our pilots, using, as well as having some quantitative research there, qualitatively assessing, like through interviews and then an analysis of those interviews, actually what was making it work locally and what was stopping it working. And what we found was that, so we measured, you think, well, how do you, and many of you will think, you know, how do you actually measure resilience? And we made use of, with support from the Big Lottery, and particularly from Anna Freud, their evaluator, made use of a student resilience survey, which is one validated survey for measuring resilience. And what it does is measure each of those competencies separately. So it doesn't say resilience is one thing, but it's measuring how well students are self-ranking themselves against each of those competencies, and it's been psychometrically validated. And we showed that there was significant increase in the mentees taking part. Interestingly, not in the mentors, and we can perhaps come back to reasons why that. It might have been how we sampled, we didn't do it at the beginning. It might be that actually it didn't increase resilience in the mentors. And we also looked at the qualitative work to understand what are the clues, how could we refine the intervention to make it work more effectively in the local context. A couple of key things which came out of that analysis was that, the joint role of the youth worker and psychologist was viewed very positively, as were the group activities which we put round the one-to-one mentoring. And those are two things actually which have both come out of that previous literature. They were certainly very well received by young people in Newham. The role of young people in promoting the project was really key, and it's got wider lessons as well in terms of peer recruitment to get the right people to take part. And we found a number of challenges as well. Needs to be clear expectation setting of what the mentees could expect from their mentor. And also real challenge around the literature was saying, you know what, mentoring when it happens in a natural place, like on a bus, you know, when you have a chat with your mates, that's where mentoring really works. But clearly, school colleagues in the room probably aren't very happy with that, you know, just leaving two people independently to get on with something. So thinking, how can we do something safely, but still allow it to feel like a natural environment? That's the kind of balance we've been trying to strike. So we had it after school, we had a youth club type environment, but it still clearly wasn't quite perfect. And a few general lessons which I think we've taken from it, and then we'll stop with kind of the thoughts, is I think when there's different approaches, when you've got something like we've had here mentoring, we've seen mentoring worked, and lots of you will be thinking, you know what, why don't we do mentoring locally, or we might be. And there's different models available, and you don't know which is the best one to choose. It's not enough just to know that mentoring works. You have to try to unpick and think, what are the key things, you know, what are the key parts of it which are important when we deliver something locally to include? And that's something that's challenging, but it's quite important. That you have to work, even you've got an ideal model, and this is kind of, it's obvious, but when you've got anything which you've taken off the shelf, we haven't taken this off the shelf, but when you've developed something you think this is going to work, you have to work with local professionals and the beneficiaries, the young people themselves, to understand actually how can you most effectively deliver these components. In fact, when you're trying to work out if something works, we always think, you know, you think there's any way to measure something, but actually if you really want to prove something has worked and to be able to understand if there's a difference, rather than reinventing your own scale, use one which has been shown to at least measure what it says on the tin. But don't forget the need to, as well as seeing, you know, has there been a change, try to dig a bit deeper like we've tried to do here and think, use some interviews, some qualitative work to understand what were the things which are making it work better or not. And really try, as we've tried here, to actually, and you'll see it in a couple of our later examples, to think, actually, can you try and deliver a consistent model so that every school you deliver it in is looking similar, so that A, you know what's being delivered, and at least you can, in theory, think it's going to work. But B, you can at least, when you're evaluating to see if it does work, it's somewhat consistent. Because that's the only way you're going to make a case to scale something up. So maybe I'll stop there for a couple of minutes, but see if people have got any questions so far, or thoughts. I've got then a sort of couple more examples.
How many sessions or how long, how many months did the pilot run?
How many months? So the model we developed is for that the mentoring takes place over a term. And that's been a very pragmatic decision because of obviously how schools work. And that the mentors get trained up for 2 days beforehand and then have 2 weekly supervision during it. But it's a good example of what one of our key components was there needs to be upfront training and supervision and some of the things which that training had to involve, and that it needs to be regular structured mentoring. Clearly nowhere says, oh, actually there is some sense of the optimum length of a mentoring relationship. It's not actually very clear in the literature what that is. But we said, you know, it's not clear. What is clear, it needs to be regular, it needs to be structured. How do we fit that locally around what's going to work? And so hence we chose a term. So it's kind of bringing together the local and the evidence.
I was wondering what attracted the mentees to the programme locally. Did you say to them, mentoring will improve your emotional resilience, or what reasons for people engaging?
It's a really good question, V. And I think it's been, I mean, it'll be stuff which people will be better aware than I am, but I think a lot of our learning from our pilots in general, including this pilot, has been that clearly when you're developing any sort of, and this is a preventative intervention, you know. This is not you working in the youth offending team where parents are being told they have to take part in something or, you know, they'll go to jail. I appreciate that doesn't happen. But where, you know, there's no compulsion for people to take part in these things. They have to want to take part. And it has to be in a non-stigmatizing way if they want to. And so there's a challenge, there's a balance here between making sure you reach the right people, you know, who are going to benefit from this, because it's an investment, you want to actually reach the right people, but they need to want to take part. And so we had a big focus, I think probably 3 of our things we've learned is that it needs to be promoted as a positive opportunity. So some kids, actually a lot of our kids do get the idea of resilience, and actually it resonates very well with kids, certainly from our experience. But actually the chance to do better at school, to do better, you know, to succeed and to develop new opportunities, particularly as a mentor to develop new skills, those things were very positively received. I think that's the first thing, how you promote it. The second thing was involvement of other young people. So we brought in actually mentors who hadn't obviously done the same program as a new one, but who'd been involved in other mentoring to talk about their experience. And people who had a mentor before as well, so been mentees, we got them to talk about experience. Because kids are clearly much more likely to listen to their peers than anyone else. So that was really key. And I think the third thing has been the key role of kind of and this has been across our projects, the key role of, I guess, kind of informal educators in this. So for sure, talking to teachers and Senkos and others in the school to understand, you know, who could benefit. And we had recruitment criteria, but actually using our youth worker particularly to actually be that more informal presence in the school that young people could talk to. We ran tasters, etc., so they can find out a bit more, start to build up a relationship with someone a bit different in the school. I think that was certainly some of the feedback from our school staff that was very positively received.
So the youth worker was an external person recruited to be embedded within the school, or? So
yes, our model is that it's delivered by a youth worker and psychologist who come into work in the school. And actually, interestingly, some of the, perhaps behind your point, some of the learning, some of our wider learning from this and actually influenced some our other work as well, has been that whilst schools will often have or may have suitable people to be kind of running these projects, whether it's a learning mentor or others, obviously that varies, it's often a real capacity issue. And that actually what our schools have liked this model is that it's actually been brought in extra capacity to the school to deliver this work. And that schools actually, certainly in Newham, have appreciated that, rather than, whilst you kind of think perhaps having it in-house is a sensible thing to do, that's not a cheap option, because clearly those staff who are doing that, and I'm sure sort of teaching will be saying the same, while they're doing this work, you know, they're not able to do other work.
How do you measure resilience?
So I'm never saying much with Jess in the room, but I think there's a number of scales, a number of approaches. I think all sorts of people attempt to measure resilience, and I think the approach which we've gone for is which was supported by the kind of Big Lottery with Anna Freud's expertise, was to choose the Student Resilience Survey, which I think comes originally from California, and which focuses on breaking resilience down into those different competencies, some of which I described at the beginning, and actually asking young people to self-assess themselves against each of those competencies. And it's been shown it's validated in terms of people give consistent responses each time, and also it seems to actually be measuring something real. Real.
They don't lie. They don't lie in the test.
They don't lie on the test, as in they don't.
I'm not trying to be mean.
No, not at all. It's a very good. I've wondered exactly the same. Like, as in students might just write anything down.
Yeah.
I think clearly they do, and I'm sure some students do. I think part of my understanding is that through part of the kind of assessment of this is a valid scale means that on average, some people just write nonsense, but on average it is measuring something real. I don't know, Jess, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, that's right. So in terms of the validation, we've tried to find different ways of looking at, whether we think it's measuring what it ought to be measuring, and there will be always where somebody had an off day and it might measure instead of their competencies, it might measure that they had an off day. But we think on average it would sort of pan out, that we would on the whole get a sense of those competencies. The only thing I would do, so we might have a slightly different perspective, but so they are part of competencies which I suppose I would view as part of a mechanism that supports resilience. And resilience is very much, as you were saying at the beginning, about that relationship between presence of risk and a good outcome. So some of those things obviously would also have to be captured, but that's the bigger picture we're going in.
Yeah. Bill, why don't I take one more question, and then I might just go on to describe a second example. Please. You what, sorry? Do you mind speaking up slightly?
Sorry, about older peers,
Yes.
Is there any data on what ages, more specific ages?
In terms of what we did, from the evidence, why we chose a peer approach was it talked about near peers. I appreciate that's a bit of a vague term, and I think people have done different approaches. We took that and we worked with our kind of young people to understand that as a near peer being someone who actually you could see as having a similar, as being similar to you, but wasn't your age. In terms of, they were different to you, but you could still relate to them. And I think that was the key, which we wanted to keep. What that meant locally was that we, at least in our pilot, we recruited 16 to 18-year-olds as our mentors and 12 to 14-year-olds as our mentees. So I think year 8 and 9 and year 12, 13. But I think it's the near peer which is the important bit. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a second one of our pilots and see, try and draw out some of those kind of lessons which we learned from it. So something else we wanted to try, it was very apparent from looking at what promoted resilience or what promoted some of those competencies. That taking part, and again it's kind of obvious, but volunteering or taking part in what the Americans seem to like calling service learning interventions, which is sort of defined as sort of teaching and learning strategies that attempt to integrate community service with an academic curriculum. That sounds very American to me, but you kind of get the picture. Basically, getting young people in schools to take part in social action projects or volunteering in the community, being shown, I think probably fairly consistently from what we could see, to promote some of these competencies, particularly self-esteem, problem-solving, community and school connectedness, and empathy. But the problem was, when we thought about it and talked to some of our schools, and many of you be well aware of it, is the typical, or in fact I'll ask, who typically, when you run, I don't know, in a school, and if you're working in a school and you've got, I don't know, a volunteering project, but maybe like school council or something, or like some social action project in a school, what sort of kid normally takes part? Sorry?
Ones who are generally high achieving.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we heard consistently from our schools. And it's kind of, it kind of makes sense. I mean, it's a bit like, it's kind of the same as it always, isn't it, I think? But actually, the people taking part are probably the people who don't really need to take part. Or maybe that's not quite fair. Like, if you want to, it depends what you're aiming for. If you want the project to be a real success, then perhaps you want a mix, but if you want the people taking part in to benefit, you need to make sure you reach the right kids. So we wanted to say, how can we get our more vulnerable kids, people who we're trying to build resilience in, to stop them developing those future problems? How can we get them to take part? So that was our kind of first challenge locally. And also, again, if we were going to sort of show that one of these approaches worked, it wasn't always that clear. Although lots of schools were doing volunteering, there were lots of providers and people could bring in to do it, it wasn't quite clear that there weren't that many kind of consistent models for actually how you do it. So we could then, at the end of the year, say, this is what we did, and actually, then we can see if it works or not. And it was pretty varied what schools, it was a bit ad hoc what people do. So we looked at some of the evidence around it, and drew out, and it's interesting to look at actually if you're interested, what some of those key components. So where's the momentum, we had to kind of draw that out for ourselves. Actually, there's quite a lot of stuff around volunteering, what seems to make it work, the work had been done for us. And some of it, they're kind of obvious things, but that successful programs were those that link learning back to the curriculum, provided students with a key voice in developing their own activities, actively involved the community, as in weren't just doing to the community, and provided space for student reflection on the experience. And so we set ourselves a task of saying, can we bring in, and all sorts of providers who are knocking on our doors saying, we can deliver kind of volunteering stuff in your schools. Can we work with one of them to develop the kind of volunteering project we were looking for, which would do those things and reach the right kids? And I guess our first lesson really with it was to say that actually don't be, if you're in a position where you're looking to, or either you're an organisation yourself or you're looking to bring in an organisation, think what are you trying to get from them, and actually if you're not sure they're doing the things which you know are the right things to be doing, actually don't be shy to push them for what you want. So I think I kind of said that. So we basically worked with our provider, so our commission provider brought in someone, to try and develop a model which focused on youth workers, working with young people in schools to promote the opportunity to the right young people. So it's again that same story of how do you work with peers and youth workers to promote it to get the right people to take part. And then people who choose to take part, and it's very much promoted as a kind of positive opportunity. This is a social action project, chance to do something very different. Typically in kind of year 6, year 7, year 8 is where we've been piloting. But those young people as a group themselves are supported by the youth worker to co-develop a volunteering activity or social action project, initially in the school, which then extends into some work in the community. Times built in for one-to-one reflection at the beginning, middle and end of the term as well, between the youth worker and each young person, to reflect on that wider learning. You'll remember the previous slide. And strong focus on actually the youth worker working with our local community to actually set up, so when the kids are saying, we want to do this, we want to build a new old people's home, and actually thinking, it's not going to happen in a term, but looking at, where can we develop appropriate opportunities in the community, and actually building those sustainable links between the community and the school. What do we find? That kids who took part, and these are kind of early findings, and we're getting it formally evaluated at the moment, but so our early look at it, but there was significant increase in resilience, using the same surveys before in kids who took part. And interestingly, really important to us, but actually most of the kids taking part were within the kids we were trying to reach. And we used in the pilot the kind of our local Ronnie indicators, which some people will be aware of, probably more aware than me actually. I don't know if anyone in the room wants to describe what the Ronnie indicators are or not. Basically used in quite a lot of schools to understand the kind of young people who are likely to go on to do poorly at school and likely to go on to have poor employment and higher education opportunities, typically is how they use it. But essentially, it was kind of a checklist for schools to be thinking, who are the young people who might benefit from this, who our youth workers could and then go to talk to. Again, we looked at some qualitative work to understand actually what was the experience of young people taking part and what was making it work well and less well in the 4 schools we were working with. General feedback was very well received by schools, and I think particularly, and it's not there, what the schools really liked was that typically the kids who were taking part, they were in some times surprised, amazed that these kids were choosing to take part in these activities. And again, it's that role of a youth worker, and again, the role of someone external coming in, I think, which are quite key. And that this was a different opportunity within the school, particularly in kind of year 7, 8 on. Some idea that some early sort of soft sense that improvement in behaviour in the kids who were taking part. And clearly we got some lovely kind of letters and things from some of the community organisations who they were working. So we had kids, for example, helping with sort of community garden projects. One of the schools had decided they wanted to, I think, make toys and different things for to send overseas to, I think, to Syria. We had people working, putting on events at Adult Day Centre, various different things, and there's some really quite positive feedback around that. And what's key is we're now looking at, although we've clearly brought in someone to help us to deliver this, actually looking at, we clearly have youth workers ourselves in Newham, and thinking, how do we train our local youth workers to deliver this model, but at the same time make sure that they are delivering consistently, and kind of thinking, I just had a meeting this morning actually about it, what a kind of train-the-trainer model would look like for that. So I think I probably said some of these. But pushing your provider, or if you're an organisation yourself, being harsh on yourself to say, actually, are we delivering what's known to actually work? And not saying it's enough to say, oh, we do volunteering because it's been shown to be a good thing. Like, actually, how are we doing with volunteering as well as we can? And how are we doing it consistently? I think a great sense of actually you've got the model, but again, how are you flexible in how you deliver? How do you keep those components, but how do you deliver it? If the school's saying it's not going to work during the daytime, well, we do it after school. If actually the school is struggling to recruit the young people, bring in more youth worker support into the school to do that. Thinking pragmatically, how do you actually deliver this? Saying to the young people, actually, why are you not choosing to take part? So interestingly, although we call it here supportive volunteering, a lot of feedback we had from kids is, don't call it supportive volunteering. So we won't be calling it supportive volunteering. It'd be much more moved towards social action, helping others, those kind of things. Because they think it does sound a bit naff, to be honest, doesn't it? The key role of actually kids saying we want to, develop the things ourselves rather than being told you're going to go and work in the. Interesting actually, when a lot of the kids who first heard it were saying being told you're going to go and help, I don't know, in the community do this sounds a bit like community service. Do you know what I mean? It's not all that positively received. Having a consistent model will mean that we can then upscale it. We can train our own youth workers and actually looking at an accreditation model so they can consistently deliver it. Really important, I think is your point before, the importance of actually that the project was open to all students and promoted a positive opportunity. And I think that's probably the extra point I didn't make before, but actually by opening it to everyone so that anyone can choose to take part, but then doing some soft kind of recruitment work with those people who really want to take part, that's, I think, certainly been some of my learning about how you can get the people you want, but without it being a very stigmatising thing. It's that balance, I think. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but
It's just coming for 6.
why don't? Shall I leave it there? Actually, I think. Yeah. I think very happy to. So I think what I've really done is I hope kind of given a sense of what we've been trying to do in Newham, given a couple of examples of projects which we've piloted and what some of our learning from that. I think what I'll do is finish. I was going to talk about a third example, but you'll see that on slides anyway when they come around. We'll come on to that in a sec. But just to finish it, what we're really doing, just sort of interest, is we're taking the learning from our projects and we're seeking to scale it up across the borough. And what we've really been trying to do, and I think is of general importance, to kind of think, not just which worked locally, but what have been some of the kind of implementation lessons around that? What's made it work, what's made it not work, so that we can learn and actually deliver a successful program at scale. Key locally to getting buy-in from some of our leaders, and clearly, which will be key to actually convincing people to fund this in an ongoing fashion, regardless of whether we get any more funding. We'll be able to, in the future, we've been able to demonstrate in our pilots that they do promote resilience, but actually that it leads to those secondary outcomes. So we're starting to do work at how we can link what we're measuring in schools and elsewhere to data which we already collect and hold on a lot of these young people, like who is being referred to social care, how are these kids doing at school, things which are already, not just in Newham, but in everywhere, are being collected and often held by your local authority. And I think making that case is clearly important. I mean, it's lovely to say this promotes resilience, but actually that's not going to convince, your commissioners to fund it, unfortunately. And what we'll be really interested in is, going forward, is looking at, yes, do each of these interventions actually work at scale? But particularly when a young person experiences more than one of them, is there some additive value there? So I'm going to leave it there, but please, questions?
Which of the interventions have been more effective?
So I think, let me just go back to, so people can see. So I think it's a good question. I mean, it's quite a difficult question because I think it's probably quite early days. I think what I would say that I think the intervention have been targeted at particularly young people. Kind of focus. So whether it's our volunteering project I described and our mentoring, we've certainly shown in individual people it has promoted resilience, and it's been the schools. It's been easy, or relatively easy, to bring in a team into the schools to deliver that work. So I think it's worked and it's been quite easy to do. And with our, which I haven't talked about today, with our parent training, where we've actually been piloting, which is not our model, the EPEC peer-led parent training, that comes from the Maudsley. It's an approach where parents are trained and supervised to deliver parenting courses to other parents. So the content quite similar, some of you may be aware, content quite similar to more traditional parenting courses, but just delivered by parents, being shown elsewhere, actually, and in Newham, to deliver improved parenting outcomes and better ability to support their children. And interestingly, which is why we chose a peer approach, actually really good engagement with vulnerable parents. We had a really high take-up. So I think that's been very successful, although challenging to, as ever, we've been piloting it both in school and community settings, challenging to get the parents to come. I think it's been much more successful in some of our traditional parenting courses, other evidence-based courses we've had in Newham. But it's still ongoing challenge to actually get. We found with that actually it's a momentum thing. Once some parents start to hear about it in the first term, by the second term you've got more parents, by the third term more parents. So it's kind of building up. I think with our resilience campaign early days, this has really been our attempt to look at some of the resilience competencies and to understand, we've been working with young people and supported by a social comms agency to understand, and the Young Foundation as well, to understand how can we develop a workbook, an online resource which supports kids to understand some of those competencies themselves and to think what they can do in their day-to-day life to promote some of them. That's early days, we're just piloting at the moment, so we'll wait to see. So our bounce back workbook. Actually, I can share the link for people's interest afterwards. And I think early days. Our last one, which has been really which I haven't had a chance to talk about today, but this has been providing, supporting schools to really, around our whole school ethos. So good evidence, and many of you will be aware that actually it's not enough just to provide individual interventions for vulnerable kids in school, but actually some quite good or reasonable evidence that if you can create a more positive school ethos around policies, behaviour plans, etc., how vulnerable kids are identified, but actually that can have positive benefit both on vulnerable kids and less vulnerable kids in the schools. And we've been working with a provider to support the schools really through an organisational development approach to understand what they're doing currently and what more they could be doing, and been providing some resilience training to those staff as well. The challenge there has been that there isn't really an evidenced approach to doing that, which we've been able to see. And so we've been working with a provider to think, how can we produce some sort of consistent approach here, which we can then seek to evaluate. And I think the challenge with that approach, apart from kind of what I've described, is that it's demanding more of the schools. It's easy for a school to say, yeah, come in and do this. But actually, if we're working with a school, asking for school staff time to be trained and asking for schools to actually think what they're doing, how can they change it, it's much harder on the school, obviously. Do you mind speaking up slightly? Is that all right?
Amongst the mentees that you had on the programme in the pilot, were there any children that actually come from the care system, or would they have naturally been screened out?
Really good question, and I don't know the answer actually. Because we recruited people, school staff referred, but didn't need to share specific reasons why. They just had criteria to look against, and people self-referred as well. So we didn't collect information on whether they did. As we scale this up, we will be in the anonymous fashion for sort of service improvement. We will be actually looking at which young people take part, and clearly, as a local authority, we have data on which of those young people, for example, looked after it. So that'd be really interesting to see, because clearly we would be hoping, in terms of some of the more vulnerable people who would choose to take part, it would be some of those young people.
I'm only asking because looked after children as a cohort, I very often seems a consistent group, which obviously is not. But then, do you prefer to learn alongside and not to be seen as being singled out?
Absolutely.
And also answer that dilemma about having vulnerable children alongside less vulnerable children, how that learning can take place.
Absolutely. So I think it's really interesting, and it's been fascinating actually. Part of the push, as always, I think, of these programs, including from our funder, has been, we need to be working with these more vulnerable kids. But we've pushed back somewhat and said, yes, we do, because those are the kids who need to take part. But a lot of our findings, and it sounds similar from what you're saying, is that actually across our projects really is that young people, it works much better where it's more of a mixed group.
You've mentioned a number of challenges that you've had in Newham, but I was wondering whether anything in particular stood out as being a particularly large barrier that you've had to overcome in implementing this in school.
In school? So or in general?
Any of the across the board.
So I think probably two challenges come to mind. I think one is particularly with the school buy-in being vital that we have that I think you need, certainly my learning has been that you need at two levels. You need to have kind of a senior and sort of school leads in the room. I mean, it's kind of obvious, but you need to have real buy-in and sign-up to this from the kind of senior leadership in the school. They want this to be taken part and they all support it, particularly the whole school approach, but I think for anything to be taken part in the school, because they'll then be pushing their staff to make sure this happens. But that's not enough. You need to clearly have, at a more junior level, someone who actually has the time to be supporting this work. I think that's been really crucial. I think it's the first thing. Second thing, if I'm allowed to have three actually, the second one is that a need to give quite a coordinate. So in our pilots, it's been challenging, but we've been, testing a number of different approaches and doing that quite separately. And I think that's been challenging for schools, particularly if they've been involved in more than one of them, and a few of the schools have. That they've got a lot else going on and want to be very clear what the offer is, and that it's joined up. And I think it's probably a common problem in localities that actually where schools and others are all sorts of things are going on, and actually trying to make sure that things are linked up is really important. And I think the third challenge has been, I think a lot of the work, whether it's the peer mentoring or the peer parenting work, relies on actually not just being delivered by peers, but actually a lot of the promotion where it works is being done by peers. But that's always a tension where, so we've seen it particularly say with our schools where they said, we know who should take part, or we know which parents could benefit, and they say, we'll send the parents. And obviously they don't come, and actually allowing the kind of peer facilitators to do some of this work, that's been quite important. And where that's happened, we've had massive numbers. Where it hasn't happened, we've had less good numbers. Please. Again, do you mind speaking up slightly? Sorry. Thank you.
You emphasize the importance of clarifying what mentally can expect from
Yes.
And can you be more explicit about it?
Sorry, I think our model sort of developed today is very much focused on, I think we basically missed a trick. That we're a big focus on training the mentors to be ready for a role. There wasn't really any focus. Mentees were, they chose to take part. It was advertised in a taste session which gave them a sense of what it was about. They didn't really have any preparation for actually understanding what was going to happen. So suddenly they presented their mentor, and actually it's a bit unclear what to expect. I think that's been the first challenge. And secondly, that a lot of the evidence which we'd seen was around actually, rather than it being too prescriptive of a mentoring relationship, you set your goal, you do this, probably what a lot of people will be used to in their kind of day-to-day work. Actually, where mentoring works best is where, I forgot some word, but where it's much less prescriptive. Actually, it's about developing a relationship and using that to promote change, which is all lovely and good, but a problem comes that realistically, in the first couple of sessions, it becomes quite challenging. Actually, what do you talk about? And so I think we're looking at trying to put a bit more structure to that. It's trying to strike that balance.
Okay, nice.
Please.
You mentioned secondary outcomes such as mental health, educational attainment, or employment outcomes.
Yeah.
How far in terms is it after 1 year, 3 years, 5 years are you thinking tracking?
How long will we track for? I think it's a really crucial question. So our funder would like us to kind of know within a month. Realistically, we will be tracking, so we'll be locally measuring in our schools resilience and well-being and mental health symptoms in all young people who are possibly taking part. That'll be in an anonymous way with an online survey. And we'll then be tracking that. Actually, I think it's my last slide just for interest. We'll be linking that to, that's a really horrible colour, I apologise. Linking it to other data which you have, so school education data and social care data and other things to see, to actually track those secondary benefits. We'll be seeking to do that each year and actually pulling out that data each year. So we hold that on a data warehouse. And many of your localities will do similar because of existing programs like sort of troubled families programs and things. So we'll be looking each year. We plan to certainly do it for the kind of 5 years if we get the funding of this rollout program. But we intend to do it further forward, particularly where we're looking at NEAT outcomes, so we can actually look, because clearly these things take time down the line. Realistically, we don't really expect to be able to see any change for kind of 3 years or so, particularly because we need to have any young person, so we'll be seeing which young people have been exposed to each activity, but not all will take part in anything in the first year. We need a baseline, we need to follow up. So you can, on our kind of vague modelling on it, again, looking nervously at Jess, we don't think we'll realistically get much for 3 years. Oh, I might just before, was any, no, lovely, please do.
What's the after service for both the mentees and the mentors? Because presumably it's over a particular space of time that they're going to be working together.
So a really, really good question. In terms of the actual mentoring model itself, this is a kind of a one-off term thing. Having said that, clearly, I guess two answers to that. In terms of it's why we're very much looking locally at kind of having a provision of a multitude of opportunities, so that it's not, like, we're under no illusion that you have, even if we begin to show that there's some change in resilience here, and that mentoring, and actually a lot of evidence around, which I've seen around mentoring, is that, as with lots of things, that the kind of benefit wanes, drops off. And so you need to be kind of providing other support ongoing. These are still kids who are at risk, because they're still living in often very poor housing, difficulties at home, parents with like mental illness themselves, all sorts of things. I mean, as you'll be well aware. And so we're looking at providing a number of interventions which would be seeking for young people to be involved in. So it might be the same young person typically has, taken part in a social action project, has had a mentor, their parents might have received some support, they're maybe getting some extra support from their teachers, have had some training. It's looking at that whole package, and I think that's quite important when you're thinking, one intervention is never going to solve the ills of your area, unfortunately.
Just ask, what sort of schools are taking part? Middle schools or academies, or what type of schools have actually sort of?
So I think we've certainly had a big interest in the pilot. I think it's been popular with schools. I think because whereas if you say this is a mental health project, often schools are like, what's it got to do with us? I think quite rightly, in the same way if you say to like a hospital, you're going to be doing teaching, they say, what's it got to do with us? But whereas the resilience agenda, I think certainly our experience resonates really well with schools, and it's kind of a key part of often what schools see as their core business. But tell me if I'm wrong. So we've had in our pilots, we've had big interest from primary schools. So we've been working with our age range for this work is kind of across these projects. Have been in the pilot 10 to 14, and if we get further funding, will be 10 to 16. So that's obviously predominantly secondary schools, but with some work at the upper end of primary, year 5, year 6. We've had interest, we've been working with, I think, 17 actually, primaries and secondary schools. Mixture of, at the moment in Newham, most of our schools are still under local authority maintenance, but increasingly, as in lots of places, are becoming academised, if that's a verb. Is not. And some of those schools, obviously got different backgrounds in terms of the site of schools. We've had a focus on mainstream schools, but looking to provide some bespoke support to kind of our special schools as well. But interesting to think about how different some interventions might be more appropriate for that more vulnerable audience than others.
I've just got a question about resilience in the mentors themselves.
In the mentors?
Yeah, and they place, if I'm right, in quite a position of responsibility. Who's supporting them when they're being
For sure.
faced with risky
For sure.
children at risk?
For sure.
Who's training them?
For sure. So it's a really, really good question. It's exactly. Sorry, please finish.
It all feels a little bit not very well held.
For sure. So it's a really, really important question. And actually, it was exactly why we sought to develop our own model, because it was probably one of our key drivers. But actually, very often what we could see is that where there were peer mentoring programs, there was fantastic actually safeguarding training and support for mentors, but actually it was quite limited actually what skills the mentors were being given and kind of, I guess, what ongoing supervision they were being provided. That's really been a focus of our developed model. To look at, I guess, how do you recruit the right mentors? And there were lots of debates actually about, for sure the mentors will benefit, but this has to be predominantly about the mentees. And actually those mentors themselves do need to be fairly, as you described, resilient themselves, if they're going to do this role. So actually, following up from your question, often quite a nice thing as someone who's previously been a mentee or previously been through some of the other things, this might be a really good opportunity. But really key to make sure that our training is being provided by a youth worker and psychologist together. And it's specific training both around those mentoring competencies, but also around safeguarding issues. And that through regular group supervision, so fortnightly we've had in our model, but again, the need is not worth getting too bogged down in the kind of detail, like is it a week, is it a day, is it 2 weeks? So it was clear that there had to be supervision, and we chose sort of pragmatically to go for 2 weeks. But there's a chance for that training to be reinforced, and particularly, so that's again delivered by the psychologist, the training to be reinforced, and that if safeguarding issues have come up, that's a real opportunity for them to be brought, and clearly in between those times, if opportunities for them to be brought up as well. But lastly, it's been really important to ensure, and absolutely crucial both in our schools and where we pilot it in the community, to make sure that you limit where that mentoring takes place, that it's quite clear that this happens at a specific time and place. You have a contract between a mentor and mentee which limits that, and that the mentor's quite clear what their role is and what their role isn't. And I think those things are really crucial. And I think of wider interest, like there's lots of wider interest in peer mentoring at the moment.
Did you have controls for any of the pilots?
So again, really good question. For these particularly, we haven't had controls, but so the bottom line, we haven't had controls. We certainly intend in our, if we scale this work up, when we'll be this kind of evaluation we've described, where we'll have an opportunity to have at least controls of a type in our schools, young people who haven't been exposed to any of the Head Start activities, who will act as a sort of natural control.
If you're tracking over time, the longer you're tracking for,
yes,
the more the likelihood that young people will have access to other interventions.
Yes.
So how are you kind of dealing with that one?
As in how that I think it's again very reasonable. I think our answer to it really has been, or will be, that again we'll have that control group, that the young people who haven't, who will equally may well have been exposed to other activities. So young people with low emotional well-being, who for whatever reasons haven't taken part in Head Start activities, but may have equally taken part in other things, and we'll be able to see what other, certainly to an extent, what other interventions they've taken part in. And I guess the other question is that, or other hope is that it won't be perfect, but is that by yearly doing that survey and that monitoring, we'll be able to see in that last year, a kid who's taken part in a particular activity, has that had some effect on them compared to people who haven't taken part. But I think it's certainly not going to be perfect. I think it's going to be a bit messy. But Jess, I don't know if you would add anything there, please.
Because I'm leading the evaluation of the national evaluation of Head Start for the curriculum. So there's no, the design of the programme is such that there's no sort of control group, it's not a randomised control trial. And as you can probably see by the complexity of what is being delivered in Newham, that is replicated for 12 different areas. So trying to find a sort of model that suits that would be not would be suitable.
I mean, I would have thought that tracking what kids have access to would be helpful, if nothing else.
Yeah.
So that's exactly, so at the moment we're at the pilot stage, but Simon and the other partnerships have been involved in quite a long, lengthy process now, which so we've all worked together on a measurement framework moving forward over the next 5 to 6 years. And part of that is around capturing what children do receive. So we'll have a better chance of clearly delineating what they receive that's under the umbrella of Head Start, because we can know what that is and we can begin to sort of characterise it. Whereas other things that happen in school that aren't Head Start, we're less well able to do that. But at least we can see, and I know science is particularly interested in where people have received more than one. Is there a sort of interaction as a kind of boost if if you start to join up and have, say, 3 or 4 interventions across the programme? So that particularly we would be looking at. Another thing we would do is look at the measures that we're collecting and see if there's existing data sets elsewhere of children of the same age who we're fairly confident haven't had this level of input, and we can use them as a kind of quasi-control group. And yes, again, they will also have received some things along the way, but we would expect on average those things to even out across the 2 groups.
I would have thought that information collection you've just described relies on good record keeping in the schools.
It will, and it will also rely on good record keeping at the partnerships in terms of knowing who received the interventions, and a lot of detail. So not just did they get it, but how long did they get it for, who delivered it, what were the characteristics of the people who got it, did they attend all the time, did they drop out before the end, and a whole range of characteristics.
And I think it's, just to add, I think it's why we've been very keen to ensure that each of the interventions we'll be delivering is a sort of specific approach with quite clear kind of, manualised components, so that at least we've got a sense that when we're saying that a young person has completed that activity and attended, say, 90% of it, actually at least we can say, what have they been exposed to?
So maybe, I'm conscious, sort of
please, Jess, of course.
Maybe one more question and then we
of course.
Whether we want
Perfect.
To answer
I was just going to ask about the sort of content of the mentoring that happened between the mentor and the mentee. Was the focus of it that the mentor would support the young person with more school-based activities? Like, was there a specific focus for it, or was it like a psychoeducation kind of thing where they were teaching them about resilience? Or
For sure. Really. So really, I guess two answers. Firstly, it's certainly not a kind of typical kind of academic mentoring, kind of helping with your homework type approach, which clearly important in schools as well, but that's not what it is. But the training which is then reinforced through the supervision for mentors is to focus on building a relationship with your mentee and understanding what are the things which they're seeking to change in their life, and actually then supporting them through doing that, really. So it might be that, it might well be actually wanting to attend school more and thinking, actually, how do they do that? But it might be equally, things at home or others.